to this session on disinformation. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get going. If you would please like this stream, give it a thumbs up as you're watching. Oh, what music. And also, could you subscribe to the channel if you want to chat and to ask questions? That's the only way to do it. And that off. So yes, subscribe to the channel to ask your questions and please post the stream to your socials. We are hoping that this is going to be one of a series of sessions dealing with the real issues of the day. And I really can't think of anything more timely than talking about disinformation right now. Just to explain, I read the book before Christmas and I thought we've just got to get Renée on here because I feel that we're sleepwalking into some major issues. We need to be better informed to deal with the scourge of disinformation. So without any further ado, don't want to spend a lot of time talking about sort of introducing Renée because we've only got an hour of our precious time. So we're going to go straight into questions. And I just want to start, Renée, by asking you to explain what bespoke realities are. And would we be able to spot one if we were in one?
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. So I used the term to refer to the increasing kind of fragmentation and customized capacity that we have, the idea of reality as a choose your own adventure phenomenon. So there's always been theorizing about the sort of social nature of reality in some aspects. There are certain types of kind of inarguable things, right? I kind of joke around about tornado reality a little bit in the book, the idea that whether you believe in the tornado or not, it is going to take your house out if you're in the path. But there are other types of areas where people kind of come together to make determinations. And one of the unique phenomena that we see on the internet is that those are increasingly niche. So they're not really as broad as they might have been. You're not necessarily negotiating around what is a fact and what is not, what is true and what is not, with a diverse group of people who are around you where you might have varying opinions, but you're in a sort of a shared geographical space. Instead, you're increasingly able to just do that with people who are likely to agree with you and information sources that are likely to kind of confirm your biases. And so bespoke realities, bespoke obviously is a term used for things like tailoring. You have a dress or a suit made precisely to fit you exactly what you want. And so it was sort of a way of describing that phenomenon as we individually have the capacity to decide what is going to be real for us.
And you got into this whole area really because of vaccine disinformation. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that, about how your entry point?
So I'm a mom of three, and I had my first baby in 2013. I had moved to San Francisco in 2011, but I'm a New Yorker. And for those who might be unfamiliar, in the United States, vaccine policies for schools are set at the state level, not at the federal level. And so I went from in New York, it is very hard to opt out. Like there is a religious exemption, but there is a process of review for that religious exemption. There is a board that actually decides if you have a sincerely held religious belief. And since very few religions are actually opposed to vaccination, it is a pretty high hurdle to clear. In California, there was no formal religious exemption, but there was what was called the personal belief exemption, where you could simply write on a piece of paper, I don't believe in vaccines, and that was it. Then you were opted out. And so this led to some, as I was going through this process of putting my new baby, my first child, on these daycare and preschool waiting lists, California had 10 years of public health data available. And it was very important to me. Whooping cough was pretty epidemic at the time. I wanted to be in a school. I wanted my son to be in a school with high vaccination rates. And so I started downloading these data sets, and I was just floored by some of the schools that had upwards of 30% of these personal belief exemptions. So if you think about how vaccines work, you do need to have a certain threshold in order to have herd immunity. Your child might be okay if they are old enough to have all of their shots and all of their shots take, and they're in an environment with a much lower threshold. But I really wanted to, particularly for a young infant who is not fully vaccinated, I wanted my son in a particular type of school. And so as I was looking at that data, I started writing about it, and I've actually pulled down 10 years worth of data. And my background is computer science, and I was just sort of interested in what this looked like. Sorry, my phone is beeping. Let me just turn that off. There we go. And what I was trying to do was have a little bit of a better sense of what the different dynamics were in the schools, but I also called my local representative, my state representative, and said, why is this as bad as it is? And so I put together this 10 years of data. I kind of put together a little package showing, on a blog how those trends had evolved over time. And I said, this is really kind of awful, actually. And they said, well, the anti-vaccine movement is really kind of a political force, and we're not interested in doing anything about it right now. And about 2 months later, we had a measles outbreak in California that began at Disneyland. And so the combination of it starting in, the happiest place on earth, and the fact that about 250 people or so got sick, and about a quarter of them were hospitalized. This is pretty standard for measles. It became a massive story, and the public was outraged. Why is there measles in California in 2014, 2015? So I called again and I said, is there appetite now? And they said, actually, in fact, yes, there is. And they put me in touch with the office of Senator Richard Pan, who happened to be a pediatrician. And that was how I got involved as a mom on the internet in trying to start a pro-vaccine counter movement, pro-vaccine movement on Facebook. Because what we realized was that the anti-vaccine movement was there and quite prevalent. There were groups with tens of thousands of people in them. You could add target to anti-vaccine interests, but not pro-vaccine interests. There were different ways in which Facebook's recommender systems would boost anti-vaccine groups, and there were no pro-vaccine groups. And so we said, okay, it's time to facilitate, what we now call counter speech. It was a really interesting experience for me, right? Because all of a sudden, we had to grow this movement simultaneously with trying to get this law passed, this law to eliminate the personal belief exemption, to eliminate the, hey, and now we're all just opting out because we feel like it. And so it was a very interesting time because I felt like I was seeing in 2015 the future of what every divisive political campaign was going to be like going forward. There was doxing, there was harassment, there were, people trying to infiltrate each other's groups, there was opposition research. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. came to town, and it was just this very surreal experience. And I opened the book with this story because, again, this was 2014, 2015. And then those same characters were so central to the public conversation around COVID. And unfortunately, what we saw, what we documented in 2015, was that the public health institutions were just not even in the same conversation. They thought that, we were sort of a novelty, these like plucky moms, talking to other moms on the internet. But they ultimately sincerely believed that people would continue to trust institutional authority because that was just how it had always been. And we tried to get the point across. And, I tell the story in the book that these are not just some people online, which was the phrase that they used when I was making this argument. You've got to be in the public conversation. And so the fast forward to COVID for me was just a moment of extraordinary frustration because nothing had really changed in the institutional capacity.
Scary, very scary. What do you think RFK is going to be like?
There's
Recording in progress.
Again, I think there's going to be a little bit of within the United States, because so many of these policies are set at the state level. There's not going to be some sort of big overnight change. However, there are federal bodies that are responsible for making determinations about what vaccines are approved, what vaccines are eligible for certain types of cost reductions, things like this. And that, I think, is where people are concerned. There's also just the public, the public statement, right? Having sort of a prominent anti-vaccine activist at the helm of, a major health institution is very alarming because it means that the messaging from the federal government is not going to be in support of where decades of scientific research has emphasized and found time and time again that these are very, very safe and effective vaccines. And so having somebody who has rejected those findings and is insisting on new studies and new findings, in addition to being just a waste of time and money, that discrepancy as people try to decide who to trust and what information to accept as they make a determination is they're going to be getting some very, very conflicting messages depending on on where they live and what they think of Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah. Can you sort of explain to people how, to those people perhaps who don't realize how disinformation works, haven't read your book yet, perhaps, how people are driven down different rabbit holes from having started perhaps in the vaccine space, the anti-vax space, and where they get driven and how?
So I would say I would broaden it a little bit. I think disinformation is how it's often framed, but it's so much more structural than that. It's really just a process of sorting where so the algorithm, which really refers to a whole host of curation and recommendation systems that decide what you see. So there's no neutral on social media in the kind of current platforms that we have today. There's a corporate incentive underlying what a platform chooses to show you. So from the very earliest days of Facebook, what we now call kind of like the blue app, but extending, to all of the other major social platforms, there's always been this process of suggesting accounts for you to follow. And those are curated in part based not only on your demonstrated interests, meaning if I'm clicking on a lot of food-related content, it makes sense for it to show me more food-related accounts I might want to follow, right? Create serendipity and suggest new creators to me. But the other thing that's happening there is because these platforms are doing massive ingestion of user behavior and user data across, in some cases, billions of people, what they're able to do is say that you are statistically similar to this other person over here. They like these other things, so it makes sense for us to show that to you also. And for a very long time, when those algorithms were making those suggestions, they didn't necessarily take into account what they were suggesting. It was a simple kind of correlation function. And so what you would see was groups being recommended or accounts being recommended that at times were extraordinarily, for example, conspiratorial, right? So QAnon, the rise of QAnon, which is a conspiracy theory about, the Democratic Party in the US being somehow affiliated with elite cabals of pedophiles and whatnot. It's actually spread to Europe too now. But QAnon was a function in part of recommendation engines suggesting if you engaged with one type of conspiratorial content, you might like to see more. So there's no neutral here. And so platforms have to decide both at an account level, what kind of network to build around you, right? And once that network is built around you, you're going to see content from those creators. So you are going to wind up in, the term echo chamber has fallen a little bit out of favor, but you're going to be in a particular milieu, maybe we can say, right? Just where the content that is curated for you is fairly similar. You're not, if it decides, for example, in the US, we have two parties. If it decides you're a Democrat, you're going to see more Democrat content. You're not going to see a lot of, Republican content is not going to be suggested to you. So it's a very structural reinforcement. Not only, disinformation adds another layer, right, where you have certain types of accounts that maybe are trying to deliberately mislead you, but this process of how information is curated for you, how you are recommended groups, it happens in a way that users have very little visibility into. And you just sort of slowly find your way into certain information environments. And once you do, it is actually very hard to find your way back out. And I'll give one completely apolitical example, which is I was doing work on what we call AI slop. So AI generated spam and scam content. And because I was using my Facebook account to do that with, even though it was an academic project, for about 4 months, I engaged with many, many, many dozens of AI crap content pages. And now my feed is absolutely overrun with them, and I cannot make them go away. And so this is a simple, stupid example that is completely apolitical, but it reinforces that once you have given a significant amount of signal it is very, very hard for me to sort of like change it back.
Right, that is that's very scary. We've got a very good question from Worldly Spring Onion, who says, "What do you think the goal is for those spearheading the anti-vax movement? For those swayed by the rhetoric, it may be misinformed fear of side effects or pervasive distrust of science. But for those at the head of the movements, how is a sicker population unable to work beneficial to them in the long term?"
So first, I would say the anti-vaccine movement dates back to the very, very first vaccines, right, to smallpox variolation in the late 1800s. And one of the things that is remarkable about it is how the exact same narratives that we saw in the 1800s are the narratives that we see today. And that's because they prey on very, very real, or prey is actually not even the right word. They reflect, I should say, very, very real fears and concerns, right? There's you have, like I said, I have 3 kids, and as somebody who is, stridently pro-vaccine, it's still a stressful thing to take an infant in, particularly in, the first 4 months of life where you're terrified, right? Are you feeding the baby correctly? Are you putting them down to sleep appropriately? The SID stats are out there. They're scary. It is easier to do nothing than to take an action and risk feeling like an action that you took had a negative impact. And so that's one thing that I think is really, important to be kind of empathetic about. The anti-vaccine movement is very, very good at preying on those fears. For a while on Facebook, the way that, as the vaccines cause autism myth was largely cast aside, vaccines cause SIDS actually was the ad campaign that anti-vaccine groups were running on Facebook. And as far as what is the motivation of the leaders of the movement, some of them sell webinars, some of them sell supplements, some of them are actually what you might call sort of true believers who maybe had a bad experience with a vaccine themselves, because that does happen sometimes, and they feel called to, to tell that story to other members of the public, to other moms, to sort of warn them away. And so that it is very hard, I think, for stories, right, about personal experiences, lived experiences to be the fears that they can bring up to be like done away with by presenting a fact. And this is something where I feel like the public health institutions have failed to reckon with that for a very long time. Because seeing somebody tell a personal story is much more impactful than reading a PDF that tells you that, you have a greater chance of being struck by lightning than injured by a vaccine. Of course, they don't even put it that way. They just give you the stats, and even conveying it in a way that the stat makes sense to people, that they can internalize it and relate it to something else in their own life. That messaging has just been so bad for so long. And so these extremely old resonant stories continue to work because they tap into very real human fears and concerns. And unfortunately, we watched during COVID, a lot of the things that were the most viral were the stories of, what we called friend of a friend stories about side effects. My friend's friend did this and said, and you can't reject that with a statistic. And so you had individual doctors who were trying to come onto social media to put those stories in context. Yes, somebody got a rash. Here's how you should think about this. Yes, myocarditis is a risk, but myocarditis is more often caused by COVID than by the vaccine. So that kind of communication was happening at an individual level. But then again, you get back to what we were talking about in the prior question, which is who sees that stuff? And if you're not in a universe where that kind of content is curated and pushed into your feed, you're not going to see it, but you are going to see the potentially much more viral story about the risk or the fear itself. And that's one of the real challenges. It's very asymmetric, a lot more storytelling about bad things. People don't wake up and post, I went and I took my 3-month-old to the doctor and nothing happened. They just don't post. And so there's a real asymmetry in content there.
Just you sort of trailed that you could see that this is where politics was going to go, in terms of influencing political decisions was going to go. do you feel that politicians really understand the threat to democracy from disinformation?
Um, well, one of the things that I have been a little bit frustrated by, and I really tried to get beyond disinformation in the book, is that it's a question of how do you capture attention effectively? Again, disinformation implies that there's a deliberate manipulation campaign happening, and sometimes there is, but there's also just basic political propaganda where people are telling stories and, it's an inflected story. It serves the interests of the person telling it. But I tend to use disinformation much more narrowly, right? To refer to something where there's an explicit intent to mislead, or there are fake accounts, there are fake behaviors, inauthentic amplification, there's a state actor involved, right? Like a much smaller thing. But the difference is that using tools for message dissemination, these are tools of power. And politicians recognize that power in broadcast media. But in the United States in particular, I would argue that certain types of what I call factions, like niche political groups, do recognize it and are very effective with it. And oftentimes, more institutional groups or groups that have traditionally enjoyed the reach of broadcast media still tend to think of attention as something that is like given to you. The media covers you, and that's how the facts get out into the world. Whereas other groups that maybe don't have that same type of traditional access to broadcast media really invest in building their own infrastructures of amplification and their own means of capturing attention. And when I say, again, in 2014, 2015, as we start to try to grow a pro-vaccine mom group, the anti-vaccine groups that effectively in the vaccines cause autism kind of narrative and conspiracy theory from back 20 years ago now, those groups gradually lost access to broadcast media as broadcast media stopped covering that theory when it was found to be false. But on social media, they could capture their own attention, they could grow their own audiences. And so what you see is groups that are not speaking in broadcast media realize that they can do it themselves. This is why also you'll see a lot of groups that are more marginalized are using social media because they don't see themselves reflected in broadcast media. And the main institutional political, entities don't have any reason to invest. And so for a very long time, they haven't been.
Yeah. And one of the key things you bring out in the book, and we've got a question that sort of follows on from this, is that you're talking more about, when you talk about freedom of speech, you're talking about freedom of reach. Is that's what happens. So then we're getting into a space now where this battle for free speech, which certainly seems nowadays to be the freedom to say the most vile things without any consequence, is obviously throwing up all sorts of concerns for regulators and lawmakers about how you contain that monster. And I would like to turn actually to Municat, because you've got a question, please, for Renee.
Yes. Hello. Hiya. So yeah, what I wanted to ask was, so Mark Zuckerberg has come out recently making some announcements about his changes that he wants to make at Meta. So he's announced that he wants to sort of move to a community notes style fact checking system. But at the same time, he wants to remove certain hate speech restrictions on the platform, which I think would end up in people sort of feeling hounded off the platform, basically, if they're from certain backgrounds. So basically, do you think we need like centralized hate speech moderation systems to ensure everyone's like equally represented on a platform in order to have a functional and fair community note style fact checking system? And if so, do you think that, well, how do you think that that would be achieved in a fair way? Because I ask that because basically centralized hate speech moderation systems have long been like a large part of the issue of trust on social media platforms because they're sort of seen as a form of censorship.
Yes, so there's so much there. First, as you know, they're seen as a form of censorship oftentimes. So there's there's a lot of automation that goes into those systems, and Zuckerberg referred to this in his that very long 5-minute speech that actually contained quite a lot. He mentions that I think he says about somewhere between 10 and 20% of takedowns are later reversed because the automated classifiers are not very good at detecting hate speech. Hate speech has been a challenging topic for a long time because it's so context dependent. It's not as easy as keywords, right? There are certain words that members of certain communities can use that are hate speech when uttered by other communities, but are in-group, just I have a little bit of a cold today, so my recall is slow, but that are like reclaiming, there we go, that's what I was looking for, reclaiming the term when they use it themselves, right? And so when a classifier is blunt and not particularly good at ascertaining context, you see those false positives, which means that many communities feel that they are over moderated. Everybody has some bad experience with an auto mod, making a bad call, taking it down, creates resentment. Oftentimes it's very hard to appeal. And that's one of the interesting dynamics with those things. So minimal transparency, no appeal, sloppy classifiers. Community notes is not for this problem. The community notes shift is related to the desire to end fact checking, which for some reason is a thing that is very much a fight that we're having here in the US that I think is not necessarily going to be disseminated worldwide. So the community notes to fact checking shift is happening within the United States. And that's because fact checking has been widely delegitimized quite deliberately at times on the right. And so that particular piece of it is a little bit of a capitulation. At the same time, community notes does mean that you can have user input into that process. It has been a very interesting experiment on X. It is not, in my opinion, these two things are complementary and you should have both. But community notes are an interesting way to scale some of the fact-checking challenges that the platforms have dealt with. I think I've seen stats that say that somewhere between 17 or so stories really get fact-checked per day. So community notes could conceivably help that scale up quite a bit. The question you asked about pushing people out of conversations, that is, I think, the potential real risk of the hate speech policy changes, which for anybody interested, you can go to the Meta changelog and you can actually read them. You can see in red what they've added and taken away. Unfortunately, I would argue that it is the changes that were made impact the world because those policies are global, but they were made very much in response to particular US culture war hot button issues. And so it's very much focused on LGBT and trans related speech and then immigration related speech. And so that I think that, yes, the real risk of that is that it does, that free speech is used to push other people out of the conversation. So in a sense, reduces their freedom to associate. I think that that's going to be the thing that we're going to start to see happen. You asked also, I think, is there some central control? The answer is no. And I would argue that there probably shouldn't be. And that's because, we mentioned before the differences in how different communities use language. That's also true globally. And so sorry, this stupid thing is still beeping at me here. Sorry about that. So it's very hard to do globally. Mm-hmm. And that's because there are different contexts and different tolerances. And that is where we are. Also in the US, there is not going to be any appetite for that whatsoever, because the question is who would have the authority to do that or to oversee it? Here in the States, the government would not be in any way empowered to do that. And there is so much, the problem that we face is that these are unaccountable private entities. People don't trust the platforms to make determinations, but they also, particularly in the US, don't trust the government to make determinations. This is why, and we can talk about it if you want to, one argument is how do you put that power more in the hands of users? How do you enable users to set their tolerances in ways that they and their communities can feel safe and comfortable online without trying to outsource that to some sort of international body? I know that Europe thinks about this differently. I believe the UK tends to fall a little bit more in the European line of thinking about this. But this is the challenge of trying to create global policy or shifting policy in ways that appeals to particular political parties in particular countries that will then have a global impact. I hope I answered all of that. I know there was like an awful lot in there.
Okay, thank you. Happy, Minikat?
Yes, very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn to Sean. Sean Adams, you've got a question, please.
Hi, Renee. I'm part of the Movement Forward team, and I run a music website called Drowned in Sound. And one of the things that we put a petition together for the British government about disinformation. And one of the key things I think that happens, like you were talking about the attention economy, is a lot of the advertising money gets sucked up by the ways in which they're able to put out any information they want and it turn into something which can garble up a lot of bandwidth on the internet. So I guess seeing things like Joe Rogan being funded by Spotify's advertising and subscription money, I think it was something like 250 million that he got. How do we begin to shift, I guess, almost like a de-radicalization of, or like, how do you nudge the algorithm, which I know cannot be done at scale, so that we start to see maybe more balance to where the money's going from the advertising revenue? Because obviously they're quite incentivized, especially on X, in order to share things which are going to cause maximum outrage and grievance in order to get maximum reach. And I guess similar things happen on YouTube and happen on kind of all the other platforms. So I'd just be really curious about, I guess, the two-headed thing of if the incentivization is the money, how do we shift a little bit of that? And have you seen anything which kind of like transitions the algorithm? I guess I'm thinking like most of us have probably had kids play around with our Spotify and listening to Frozen, and suddenly your Discover Weekly is no longer giving you like heavy metal, it's giving you kids nursery rhymes. So is there a version of that that's going to work?
You know, this again gets back to this problem of users having no control, right? The same way that it manifests in moderation, where you can't, aside from rather crude keyword blocks, it's very hard for a user to have influence over their moderation. The same challenge happens, what you're describing with your curation experience on Spotify, like me not being able to get rid of the garbage AI pages from Facebook. I mean, one argument to make is for things like an ability to migrate your data to other platforms that are more amenable to you. So interoperability and things like this. This is an area where I wish regulators would spend more time. I am a increasingly vocal fan of participation in places where you have the capacity to set your own discoverability. They're not monetized yet, though. That's unfortunately one of the things where what's the incentive for the creator class to go and participate? Well, they need some way to monetize. And so this is why they do continue to be on platforms with the largest followings. I think the most technologically interesting place that's allowing for that kind of user customization is Blue Sky, because it is giving users that ability to curate and to moderate their own content much more granularly, trying to create some kind of demand for that. Or if, in Europe, maybe a regulatory, kind of like a compulsory regulatory dynamic that says that platforms do have to give that control to users so that they can tweak their feeds a little bit more granularly. The other piece of it is, Joe Rogan created his demand over time. It is algorithmically reinforced, past a certain point. YouTube in particular regularly, recommends content, particularly if you engage with some of it. So that question is, how do you also continue to grow a robust content creator community that is that is engaging, that is like networking with each other, that is amplifying each other, that is growing a visible presence? One of the things that many of the political factions that do well on the internet, that capture a lot of attention, do, is they're constantly amplifying each other. There is really a strong sense of network effects. People are guests on each other's podcasts. People are appearing on each other's Twitch streams. People are co-creating content in some way when they're mutually promoting it. They're doing this on Instagram. They're doing it everywhere. Whereas other types of creator communities are much more individuals, individuals who are producing something, and they don't necessarily see the value in that cultural networking. Maybe they see people as competitive as opposed to envisioning a way to kind of mutually grow the pot. So, you have either creating more content and drawing people to it, or you have creating ways to shift algorithmic feeds. And either for that, it has to be either some sort of regulatory argument or some sort of creating, taking advantage of new technology to grow new movements. Like, what does a non-corporate social media look like? Well, it's emerging on Blue Sky, come be part of it.
Because I guess I was thinking, like, you appearing on Rogan's podcast was quite I guess not surprising to see, because like being the antidote and talking about vaccines and being able to answer questions and discuss it directly feels like but I noticed I started to see quite a lot of Rogan content and Stephen Bartlett content, because they often talk about the topics I'm interested in, but have an expert that's coming from kind of the opposite direction. So I think they sort of like understand the clustering of conversations, but if you get on someone that's got some weird climate conspiracy, it is going to show to more people. So I think the thing that I think is quite interesting about the way in which they work more collectively is it kind of goes against a lot of the ideology on the right, that things are kind of self-interested and self-fulfilling. It's so anyway, I was just kind of curious if you've seen other examples of that, just like gentle shift, like should more people from the left be appearing on those things, or should we be not giving time to those things?
No, I believe in engaging. I know that not everybody agrees. I actually got a lot of flack from the left when I did Rogan back in the day. I think there's this argument about platforming, right? And just to be clear, like, that's one of the most massive platforms in the world. Who Joe or any of these massive podcasters get is a function, like, the person being platformed is the guest. And so there is no way in which you are going to like starve a massive creator of reach. And so I do think that engagement is very, very important, because otherwise you're not going to reach that audience with any alternative form of information. And when we were talking a little bit earlier about how things are so carefully curated, if you only have a finite amount of hours in the day, and most people are, not on social media 24/7, they've got, maybe they're listening in their ear pods while they're working a job or something. But being in that place means competing for attention in that spot. And it is something where I feel that you need to be simultaneously growing a messaging platform for yourself or for your political faction, or in the case of us, like pro-vaccine moms or whatever, right? But also appearing in spaces where you'll be able to reach people with a message is also very, very important at this point. And I remember Joe Rogan used to have on Peter Hotez occasionally, and sort of pro-vaccine doctors. The challenge sometimes is when you see that that attention shift being commensurate with the person who has the largest reach moving in a particular political direction and no longer bringing on that set of diverse voices, and instead really leaning into one particular voice. And that's where the argument, it has to be made that you need to be creating more content and building up your own ecosystem as well.
So you're not going to become Joe Rogan on the left anytime soon. Anyway, thank you for your answers. We've got about 20 minutes left, haven't we, Anthea? So
yes, yeah. I think one of the problems with people appearing on that is that they feel that they then validate a platform that they don't like at all. that, you know, that they don't like most of the people who are on it. So I think
No, I know, and
we
that's
have to overcome that, don't we? That kind of
that is the counterpoint. I understand it. I really do. And again, the decision I make when I engage is, you know, I did a center right tech podcast last week. It'll be coming out, and actually it was about this. It was about the Zuckerberg shifts, the content moderation. But you know, you'd be surprised. I think you can find some common ground at times on, for example, me. You know, they were like, tell us why Blue Sky isn't just like lib Twitter, you know. And I was like, okay, great. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about why it could be so much more than that. And let's put it in terms of values that you care about, right? You want user agency. This is a place where you can really get it. You want the freedom to see the kind of content you want. Well, look, Zuckerberg just swung this pendulum back. You might feel that you've just won right now, but you have no control over who swings it back in what direction the next time. So why wouldn't you want to invest in a space where you can have this freedom and this technology? And I think it's really important to have those arguments. I tend to do it with people who I think are going to give me like a good faith hearing, or people where I've established a rapport over time. I don't go to places where I feel like I'm just going to be like harassed by the audience in the comments. But I feel that way sometimes when I go on more like left, you know, people who are to the left of me. I have that same feeling where I'm like, okay, how can I engage in this space from a place of common values, even if they don't agree with me, even if there are very few points of real agreement, there's still like a respect, like we will have this conversation and I'm not going to be, you know, deluged with hate mail after the fact.
Yeah, but I think you make a very important point about us not perpetuating division when, you know, we're not going to solve any of the problems by staying in those spaces, are we? Those isolated spaces
And not
completely.
everybody has to do it. Yeah, not everybody has to do it. I mean, there are certain places where I don't feel like I'm necessarily the best messenger, and I don't feel like I need to be in that space. Again, I assume that it won't go particularly well, but there are other people who can and do, and you know, and I think that that type of engagement is important.
I think a lot of the unease about it is because those of us who've had, you know, rough experiences on Twitter, X, where we felt very suppressed or piled on, one or the other, and hence ended up at Blue Sky, which is what really prompts this question from James S., who says, do you think the problems of disinformation and siloing of opinions, etc., can be solved without governments regulating how recommendation algorithms work?
Again, your mileage may vary in Europe and in the UK. In the US, you know, we have the kind of code is speech dynamic, and platforms have First Amendment rights, and it is very difficult for that to happen here in the US. I don't think that's necessarily bad, because, you know, the point that you'll hear many of the free speech activists in the US, the point that they'll make is, what happens when you don't like the government? Right. And we just had a government shift here, literally last night. And we got a couple hundred executive orders or whatever it is that completely throw out the last 4 years of policy. And, you know, and the question is, do you want the government in charge? And in the US, I think overwhelmingly the prevailing opinion is no. I really believe, I think I'd have to go look. It's funny because the polling here shows that significant majorities want content moderation, want to feel that they're in an online space that is free of harassment, that is, even misinformation actually polls quite high, that people want the platforms to do something. There is, I think, up until again, recently, I think people were more comfortable with the platforms doing it than the government. There was a significant amount of alarm here as the TikTok ban went into effect for, you know, all of 14 hours or whatever it was over the weekend, because TikTok policy team put out a pop-up thanking Donald Trump for bringing it back and saying how excited they were to work with Donald Trump. This is before he had taken office. So this was on Saturday, you know, obviously he took office on Monday. So that was, I think, surprising to the left user base on TikTok, which found it alarming to see a platform really kind of currying favor with the administration in a way that Meta had done just a week to 2 weeks prior. leading to this realization again that the platforms, are unaccountable private power. How the government regulates is, sometimes unfortunately it feels like very partisan. Again, pendulum swings back and forth without a sense that it's rooted in, maybe human rights law or something, as opposed to American constitutional law. So there's just differences of opinion in how this should be done. And this, again, I think kind of brings me back to that question of it is the user that gets screwed when this happens, either when the government passes bad regulation, no regulation, or when an unaccountable private party all of a sudden swings hard in one direction or another. And this is where I do think that question of what do technologies that give more control to the user actually look like, and how can we be growing that ecosystem?
Ultimately, the only power we really have is to leave, isn't it? And join another one. Can I go to Mark from Open Britain, please, to ask his question?
Thanks, Anthea, and thanks, Renee. I run an organization, and our main focus at the moment is driving a new all-party parliamentary group in Parliament, looking at creating fair elections. And we have three key objectives. One is to change the voting system, one is to take dark money out of politics, and the third is to combat disinformation. My question is about what grassroots organizations like ours and our activists can do for ourselves. There's lots of things that we can implore the government to do. There are lots of things that we could set in train to try and get tighter regulation. But what can we do? What could Open Britain supporters and indeed Movement Forward supporters do tomorrow morning to push back against the damaging effects of disinformation?
It's a great question. I think I spent some time in the book on this around, I describe it as like you've got the influencers, the algorithms, but then the third part is really the crowd, right? It's the people who come together on the internet and who network and create activist movements and who use the tools. This is where the challenge is, that you work with the affordances that you have, and unfortunately the affordances are to some extent controlled by the big corporations, the big tech companies at this point. So it is a question of like, where do you grow your movement? I think it is important to be putting out content and to have your message on as many platforms as possible. Even if you're not doing that necessarily directly yourself, you can be meaning as you're either as an individual person or as an account, but having people who are engaging in those platforms get those messages out there. So creating content and enabling people to move it across the ecosystem, it's really people that are providing that service. Somebody sees a video on YouTube, they share it somewhere else, they clip it, they put a reaction up on TikTok or whatever, they make a text-based post for Blue Sky or Twitter or wherever. It is encouraging people to be out there and visible and vocal and counter speaking as much as possible. And then it really is that networking piece is critical too. So maybe you have groups of users who are not active on a particular platform, but you have some sort of counterpart in your movement that is out there making that position more visible. We've seen many activist groups grow on social media by leveraging calls to amplify content, calls to grow a networked movement and networked counter speech. And this question of where is important, right? If it's pretty clear that a platform is not a win, or that you're not getting heard there, that question of where do you prioritize your attention and galvanize people? I think also the question is like, what do you want people to do? So when we did Vaccinate California, again, we had a particular bill that we wanted signed into law, right? And so it was very much in some ways a time-bounded project. And I wish it hadn't been. I wish we had found funding and a way to keep it moving, but it was very much like there were clear calls to action that directed people to engage with, for example, their local congressman. And so that's how I think some of the parallels where, as you're thinking about these reforms and things you want to do, recognizing that being visible online is important, but also engaging in the offline political process and having that connection so that the work that you're doing online is impacting the objective or mission that you have offline is also offline is it's a weird way to put it. I don't actually like it. I don't think there is a divide, but it is engaging with the power centers that are actually going to affect the change that you want or be able to introduce a bill or act on a bill or something.
Well, that's great to hear because we do have a very specific ask. We are hoping that we can change the electoral system by 2028, which is the centenary of all women in the UK finally getting the vote in 1928. So it'll be a nice trajectory. But the key thing, Renee, that I take from what you've just said is that ordinary people shouldn't think that they can't do anything. Each individual who has a role and can make a difference.
I think I talk about this in the context of like going viral, right? Things don't magically go viral. People take actions, and in aggregate and collectively, that's what creates the signal that then the algorithm pushes out to still more people. But it is that collective human action. Like we do have agency here, and that's why I feel that question of where do you consciously choose to spend your time? How do you use your capacity to call attention to things that you care about? You don't have to be calling attention to everything either. This is, I think, another thing where you get people who get very, very burned out or who begin to feel that rather than engaging on a particular cause they care about, they feel like they are somehow obligated to engage on everything. Sometimes there's pressure to do this. You'll get messages, from various activist groups. Why didn't you use your platform to weigh in on this or that or the other thing? I think that people realizing that they should be coming up with ways of engaging that feel comfortable to them, and then also at the same time recognizing that they do have this capacity for influence and power in aggregate is very important.
That's great. Thank you.
Very much. I think one of the big problems that we all face is that people are becoming increasingly mistrustful of all information, just as they're mistrustful of all politicians. All politicians are bad. Everything is untrue, or my facts count for more than your facts. And I think that environment is the very destabilizing one. And now to get the feeling that significant amounts of money are being thrown at perpetuating those divides and feeding them is what really concerns us. And we've got a question here. I'd love to know your thoughts on, this is from Storm Knights, I'd love to know your thoughts on the relationship between wealth and intentional disinformation. And they ask, is it to distract people from class issues?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I've seen that expressed. I think it's become a topic of conversation here in the States. Obviously, a lot of people remarked on the swearing-in ceremony yesterday and the sort of tech CEOs that were very, very prominent, even sort of the row in front of the cabinet, and what message was being conveyed there. I think there is the recognition that the platforms might not be aligned with your interests or human interests, and that is a very real thing. And that is why I think the need to create spaces that are controlled by communities is so important. There's a paper that I wrote. It came out after the book. It's sort of like, I after all the drama with Stanford, I'm at Georgetown now, but we can talk about that if you want to. But the paper that we wrote basically argues that the solution to platform power is the solution to platform incentives not being aligned with the public, not being aligned with democracy in some cases, really is this giving more power to the user. And my colleague, Francis Fukuyama, wrote this paper, part of the Stanford Platform Power Working Group in 2019, that asked the question, how do you do that? And at the time, people thought that it was going to have to be kind of compelled by regulation, that big platforms were going to have to be compelled to allow what we call middleware, like third-party tools that can act on behalf of users that give them more power. People assume that it would have to move through regulation, but now as we have much more decentralized options, the Fediverse, Blue Sky, and AT Protocol, you're starting to see investment move into those spaces, which again means that this is a time for people who want to go and explore what that is like, that sense of greater control. We can do that now. We can do those experiments, and we can see to what extent we can create there's a group called New Public here in the US. Eli Pariser, who wrote the book The Filter Bubble ages ago, he I think is the founder or runs it. And there's another example of what is an internet that gives the people much more control, that isn't operating under the incentives of billionaires. Like, what does that actually do for us? And I think that a lot of us are very excited about exploring that question right now. And I hope that more people kind of see the potential and come into the space, because the only way that platforms grow is if users go and spend time on them. And so we have to do the work now of creating spaces where that work is being done.
Yeah, and on that sort of theme, I've got a question from James S, who says, do you think being more transactional would make left-wing creators more able to collaborate?
That's a great question. I've never been a political content creator. My role as I pick, like, again, I've had the activist experience in these much more niche, like vaccines, right? These sort of areas that I care about because of my kids mostly. That it is a real question. If you want to read an interesting book, it's called Network Propaganda, and it's by Yochai Benkler. It was written, I think, around 2018 or so. And it details the rise of the right-wing media ecosystem that was like sort of Facebook first, or, web first, that really started to say, the kind of the extent to which one says something and they're all citing each other, and there's a lot of link sharing, there's a lot of attention direction, and they're moving an idea across the entirety of the ecosystem. The expansion from that, again, this was very much like web focused and sort of the early days of social media focused. But as you see those networks move into networks of influencers, I do a lot of work on influencers. The book is on influencers. Wired magazine did an incredible graph where you see just the investment in the influencer ecosystem. And when you go and look, you see to what extent these folks are engaging with each other and amplifying a collective message about, an ideological set of values, and how much more well-developed that is because that investment has gone on for so long. So I do think that there are lessons that, other kind of political groups can learn from that. You see a little bit on the, sort of supporters of Bernie Sanders here in the US during the political primary. So he's sort of a Democratic socialist. The sort of fans and supporters of Senator Sanders were also fairly good during the primaries at capturing attention and making things resonate on social media. And that question of how to expand that into different political groups so that those ideas are heard and seen is really important.
Yeah, and I think we do need to put up more of a fight, because I think one thing that's really spooked us, obviously, is the prospect of $100 million landing in the hands of a far-right party, courtesy of Elon Musk, and how we even begin to counter that kind of sort of money spend in our marketplace.
And this is where I think, again, the laws are different in the US, but questions of, is there a value there where this politician is given a particular platform? Is there some sort of means by which another politician is owed a similar platform, right? We used to have like fairness doctrine here in the US that obviously went away for a whole variety of reasons. People have mixed opinions about it. But that same question of, is there, under European law or, non-US law, are there ways of thinking about the value of that exchange, and at what points creating opportunities whereby there is a requirement that that other other parties be heard is something that maybe falls more into your, you know, campaign rules than it does in the US.
Well, the hour has gone by incredibly quickly, and I hope everybody has really enjoyed the session. Can we just ask how we can find you online?
Yeah, so I am Blue Sky, Mastodon. I'm still on Threads. I need to do more video. I just joined Lawfare, which is a blog, you know, media property, as a contributing editor. So I am looking forward to writing more stuff there. And then I have a newsletter that I send out maybe once a month. I am not a high volume newsletterer, and that's just at reneediresta.com.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time. It's been really invaluable. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
for all of those of you on the call who've got time and want to stay on, we're just going to take a few minutes just to tell you about some actions that you can take. But I might just ask Renée, just before you go, and I know you're about to go, and thank you for coming when you've got a cold too and everything.
Yeah, sorry, I'm sick.
Is what would your sort of, I mean, I think we're all reeling a little bit about what's happening in the world and what the prospects are for the planet as a whole. I wonder if you can just, it's a bit of an unfair ask, but can you give us a final kind of call to action positive that we can sort of take away from this?
I think it's really recognizing that, you know, we do have the capacity for, we have agency here, that, you know, yes, there are a lot of places where the dynamics of, like, the incentives of influencers and, you know, algorithmic amplification for private companies don't serve us. But I really do feel like I want people to go and explore some of the new and interesting ways that Blue Sky and Fediverse are trying to envision, you know, envision a better world. New Public, also, which I mentioned, has a Substack. I think there's a bunch of ways to get involved and to think about, you know, how to shape new spaces, as well as how to proactively engage in the ones that you're already in.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody who's on the call. Please stay on if you want to.
Thanks,
Lovely,
Renée.
Renée. Thank you very much. Get well soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.